Welcome to the debate. Think about your own neighborhood for a second. Imagine waking up and a water pipe has burst right in the middle of your living room. You don't form an exploratory committee.
Right, or draft a strongly worded email.
Exactly. You call a plumber. The water is actively ruining your floors. The damage is immediate. And, well, the solution is physical. It requires wrenches, replacement pipes, and somebody willing to actually turn off the valve.
Yeah, but, that's because it's a localized crisis. You have a linear solution to a very visible problem, and the timeline you are demanding is essentially, yesterday.
Right, yesterday. But what happens when that bursting pipe isn't in your house, but across an international border? What happens when the water rushing in isn't just a busted municipal main, but a continuous, unyielding flow of toxic sewage from the Tijuana River?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we are talking about a contamination event that is actively poisoning the shoreline of Imperial Beach. It's forcing long-term ocean closures and fundamentally degrading the health of an entire community. And in that scenario, suddenly the plumber just never shows up.
They don't show up at all. The city council says, their hands are tied because they have zero municipal funding. Then the state regulators point fingers at federal jurisdiction.
Exactly.
And the federal government looks at the border and claims this somehow falls entirely outside their direct oversight. It just becomes this massive jurisdictional void. And while all these agencies are pointing at each other, the local community is left literally breathing in the consequences.
Which brings us right to the core of what we are digging into today. We are looking at the independent research and the public records campaign spearheaded by Imperial Beach Technology. And, it forces us to confront a really uncomfortable question about how modern governments actually works.
Right.
Does a sewage crisis like this pose such an acute, immediate threat to long-term community health that it necessitates a private firm stepping in to force action? And more importantly, can a private research campaign actually hold the government accountable for regional infrastructure failures when every state and federal agency is seemingly missing in action?
It really comes down to a profound question of mechanics versus optics. Like whether documentation can actually replace a bulldozer.
I think it does. And just to be clear on where we are both coming from today, I argue that the immediate public health threats of this crisis absolutely demand private documentation. I think Imperial Beach Technology's aggressive use of public records acts as a highly effective, legally necessary lever to force federal and state agencies out of their bureaucratic complacency.
And I look at this and contend that, while the health and economic threats are undeniably severe, a private firm compiling data and getting rejected by bureaucracies merely highlights the complete void of agency action. It doesn't possess any actual power to hold the government accountable, and it certainly doesn't fix the physical infrastructure.
So here is why I think this kind of private pushback is really the only way forward. When you look at the data Imperial Beach Technology is putting out, they identify something crucial. This isn't an abstract environmental talking point. It's not just, the beach is closed for the weekend.
Right, it's way beyond that.
Way beyond. The crisis has breached the shoreline. Residents are dealing with foul sewage odors penetrating their actual homes. Children, families, and workers are living in the middle of an unresolved daily environmental disaster. And frankly, it has been grotesquely normalized by government inaction.
Yeah.
What Imperial Beach Technology is doing, specifically, their targeted use of Freedom of Information Act requests, or FOIA, tracking the implementation of State Bill 507B, and the Surfrider grant creates an undeniable public paper trail. This exposure is the first essential step in forcing accountability.
Wait, but
just to finish that thought, you cannot compel a massive federal entity to act until you legally prove they knew about the problem, had the tools to fix it, and actively chose to look the other way.
Listen, I agree entirely on the severity of the crisis. No American beach town should ever have to normalize the smell of raw sewage in residential neighborhoods. It's horrific.
It really is.
But I fundamentally disagree on the efficacy of this specific private sector response. Look at the physical reality we are dealing with here. We have aging infrastructure, massive systemic flooding risks, coastal erosion, and a city operating with severe municipal resource constraints.
Sure, but that's exactly why.
Hold on, a private firm stepping up to act as a documentarian doesn't equate to forcing accountability. pointing out that government agencies are missing in action, asking, where is the EPA or where is the state, doesn't legally or practically compel anyone to pour concrete. It doesn't build stormwater limits or physically cap the Tijuana River cross-border flow.
Right, but it's the first step.
But it requires complex structural engineering and billions in capital injection, not just public relations pressure and a neatly organized archive of FOIA denials.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective on how structural engineering is actually initiated in a heavily bureaucratized state. Funding for concrete doesn't just, magically materialize because it's the right thing to do.
Of course not.
It materializes through political and legal pressure, and that pressure requires undeniable evidence of harm. If you're listening to this and wondering why the EPA just doesn't step in, you have to look at what's actually happening on the ground. When toxic sewage odors are penetrating schools and local businesses, we are way past a disrupted surfing competition.
Yeah, it's in the homes.
Exactly. We are in an acute public health emergency. Think of it like a burning house. The residents are inside, the smoke is filling the rooms, but the fire department refuses to acknowledge there is a fire because they haven't received the proper interagency memos.
Right.
Imperial Beach Technology isn't trying to put out the fire with a clipboard. They are installing blaring, undeniable fire alarms to force an evacuation and a response. Without the alarm, the house just quietly burns down.
Okay, the fire alarm metaphor makes sense. And I see why they are doing it. I really do. But I'm stuck on the actual mechanics of a rescue here. I come at it from a different way. Categorizing this solely as an acute, immediate health emergency, while emotionally resonant, actually masks the deeper, chronic infrastructure decay that is the true root of the problem.
How does it mask it? It highlights it.
Because, yes, the odors are terrible. Yes, the contaminated water is a massive health hazard. But those are symptoms. The disease is the delayed remediation of aging systems, the systemic flooding risks, and the topographical reality of coastal erosion intersecting with cross-border runoff. When a patient has a chronic degenerative disease, installing a louder heart monitor doesn't cure them, it just records their decline with higher fidelity.
But that monitor forces the doctors to look at the chart.
Does it? By framing this primarily around the immediate shock of the odors and the beach closures, we risk validating a Band-Aid response from the government.
I don't think so.
Let's ask the question you brought up earlier. Where is the Red Cross? Where are the federal emergency management agencies? They aren't there because this isn't a hurricane or an earthquake. It's a slow-motion decay.
Right.
Agencies might swoop in eventually, spray some deodorizer, hand out some HEPA air purifiers, and declare the acute emergency handled, while the multi-billion-dollar infrastructure overhaul is kicked down the road for another decade. The structural reality is that Imperial Beach simply lacks the local tax base to fix an international border issue. Documenting the smell doesn't change the math.
It absolutely changes the math because it changes the legal liability. This brings us directly to the core of their strategy. Where are the agencies and why has nothing been done for years?
Exactly.
Imperial Beach Technology ran a very specific operation that illuminates the psychology of the government's absence beautifully. They submitted FOIA request FY 2024-035 to the Council on Environmental Quality, the CEQ. For our listeners, the CEQ is a major White House environmental office. The request asked for records concerning the Surfrider grant and the legislative history of State Bill 507B, trying to figure out where the oversight went.
And what did they get?
What did the CEQ say? They claimed they found no responsive records. And honestly, it actually gets significantly worse on appeal.
It does get worse. But let's look closely at that appeal, because this is exactly where your argument that documentation forces action really falls apart for me. The CEQ denied the appeal in full.
Right.
They explicitly stated that their mission does not include direct oversight, management, or documentation of local or regional environmental incidents unless they are handled through formal White House interagency processes or a NEPA review. Let's unpack the mechanics of that.
Go ahead.
An executive office of the president legally stated they do not have to act and they do not even have to keep records on a massive, ongoing, cross-border environmental disaster. Exposing that fact is a hollow victory. It doesn't force the White House to act. It proves the system is legally insulated from having to act.
Wait, no, that's not.
It shows that the federal government has successfully built a bureaucratic fortress around itself. Holding up a piece of paper that says the government legally refuses to help isn't a mechanism for change. It's a receipt for abandonment.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are entirely dismissing the legal mechanics of how an official denial works, in court and in Congress. You are asking how a piece of paper forces a judge's hand. Let me explain the how.
Please do.
The CEQ's full denial of FOIA appeal, FY 2025-A01, which was dated July 1st, 2025, is not just a receipt for abandonment. It is a loaded weapon for litigation.
How? How does that pour concrete?
Because normally, when a state attorney general or a local coalition tries to sue the federal government to step in and fix something like this, the Justice Department immediately files motions to dismiss or delay.
Sure, they bog it down.
Exactly. They bog the case down in discovery. They say, oh, we are studying the issue, or it is currently under interagency review, or it's a local zoning problem. They use the illusion of ongoing work as a shield against judicial mandates.
Right.
But by holding a piece of paper where the White House's own environmental office explicitly legally denies having direct oversight over a cross-border contamination crisis that routinely closes American beaches, a judge can immediately bypass those bureaucratic stalling tactics.
So it removes the excuse.
Yes, you take away their plausible deniability. That document gives local stakeholders the exact evidentiary ammunition needed to prove standing and demand an injunction or hearing. You cannot pierce bureaucratic apathy until you map the exact contours of that apathy. By forcing the CEQ to officially admit their jurisdictional blind spot, Imperial Beach Technology provides the legal roadmap for overriding it.
I understand the theory of legal escalation, and in a textbook, that mechanism makes sense. But let's look at the practical timeline of such an approach in the real world. Let's say that denial letter is used in a congressional hearing or a federal lawsuit.
Which it could be.
Constructed stormwater treatment facility capable of handling the Tijuana River's flow. Decades. We are talking about 10 to 20 years.
That's how infrastructure works.
Meanwhile, the crisis continues every single day. The residents are still smelling sewage right now. You are talking about a legal mechanism. I am talking about a physical crisis.
But what is the alternative here? Acceptance? Silence? The fact that the bureaucratic timeline is agonizingly slow is precisely why Imperial Beach Technology is running this campaign right now. And it's why they are linking the public health crisis directly to economic viability.
Okay.
This is the second half of their strategy. They are intensely researching the economic harm tied to reduced tourism, business disruption, slower commercial revitalization, and housing affordability pressures. By doing this, they are effectively bridging the gap between a slow legal process and immediate physical repair.
By tracking business closures?
Yes, by mapping out the exact dollar amount of the damage. They are proving that a city cannot fully recover economically while its beach is repeatedly closed. Families cannot feel secure and businesses cannot thrive when contamination is part of daily life.
I agree with that.
And the mechanism here is brilliant because it utilizes market forces where bureaucratic ones have failed. Let's say a private firm shows a 20% drop in commercial revitalization directly linked to the sewage closures.
Right.
When you officially document that a government's failure to maintain infrastructure is directly destroying local property values and commercial revenue, you activate massive stakeholders, real estate developers, business coalitions, state tourism boards, entities that possess the financial lobbying power that a small municipality lacks.
So you're outsourcing the lobbying.
Private research takes the local pain and translates it into the language of economic threat, which forces those massive market stakeholders to pressure the state and federal government to act immediately.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the structural constraints specific to Imperial Beach? The text of the reality on the ground shows that the city has a significantly smaller tax base than many other San Diego County cities. It has limited local employment opportunities.
True.
The market forces you are talking about activating the big real estate developers, the massive tourism boards, are fundamentally weaker here than they would be in La Jolla or Del Mar. If a developer sees a 20% drop in revitalization in Imperial Beach, they might not stick around to fight the federal government. They might just pull their money out entirely and invest 30 miles up the coast.
Which is exactly what the government is counting on if no one is watching.
Right, but there is a ceiling to local pressure when the tax base is small. Promising this community that relentless attention and documentation will eventually trigger a massive federal capital injection feels, honestly, almost cruel. It promises a mechanism of rescue that private research simply cannot deliver.
Cruel. That's a bit harsh.
When Imperial Beach Technology says they want to ensure the crisis is not normalized, minimized, or forgotten, that is a noble, beautiful sentiment. But without a federal mandate to fix the Tijuana River infrastructure, tracking the daily life impacts, the closed beaches, the struggling businesses, the housing strain, merely records the city's slow decline. You are measuring the water level as the ship sinks.
But measuring the water level is the only way you convince the captain to abandon the current course and call for the Coast Guard. Listen, why do bureaucracies build these fortresses of apathy? Is it just because they are evil? No.
No, it's functional for them.
It's a feature, not a bug, of modern government. It is designed to limit federal liability for local, topographical, and municipal issues. If the EPA stepped in for every single local sewage spill, their budget would implode in a month. So they compartmentalize.
Right.
Without Imperial Beach Technology publishing clear, aggressively sourced information so outsiders can understand the scale and duration of this specific cross-border problem, the federal government can easily minimize the issue as just another local municipal grievance.
I see what you're saying about the psychology of the bureaucracy. They want to contain the liability.
Exactly. And you combat that with transparency. When residents hear repeated statements from politicians about plans, studies, funding, and emergency declarations that result in absolutely nothing, they lose faith in civic society.
Absolutely.
Private research steps into that void. It tells the community, you are not crazy, you are not making this up. The government promised you these things, and we have the FOIA documents proving they have delivered zero. That validation is necessary for community resilience. If you don't track the promises against the reality, the government will simply rewrite the history of the crisis to suit their inaction.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that validation equals resolution. We are talking about a physical crisis of aging systems and international sewage flows. Validation does not stop coastal erosion.
No, but
actions here. Reviewing public records, tracking daily life impact, highlighting economic harm. None of these actions bridge the gap between knowing and doing. If the state of California and the federal EPA are absent, cataloging their failures in exercise in public relations, not infrastructure development.
I have to push back on the characterization that this is just public relations. It is the democratization of data in a system designed to hoard it. Let's look at their focus on the Surfrider Grant and State Bill 507B again.
Okay.
The fact that they are targeting the legislative history and implementation of specific environmental bills shows they are tracking the exact mechanisms of funding and regulation that were supposed to protect this community.
Right.
They are holding up the very laws the state passed and demanding to see the receipt. That is incredibly aggressive oversight. It is telling the government, we know what tools you have, we know you aren't using them, and we are going to make it financially and politically painful for you to continue ignoring us. That is how a small community punches above its weight class.
Punching above your weight class is admirable, but you're still in the ring with an opponent, the federal bureaucracy, that has infinite stamina and no obligation to fight back.
They have public pressure.
But when Imperial Beach Technology explicitly states they are not a government agency, medical provider, environmental regulator, or wastewater authority, they are offering a crucial disclaimer. They are openly admitting their own lack of operational authority. They can only question. They cannot execute.
Sure.
And my deepest concern here is that by placing so much hope in the power of public records pressure, the community might exhaust its energy fighting for documents instead of demanding executive intervention or international treaties. This crisis demands diplomacy with Mexico. It demands massive federal infrastructure spending.
But that's what the documents are for.
An adversarial FOIA campaign against the White House might yield really interesting documents, but it burns political capital without moving a single grain of sand on the beach.
That implies that political capital is a finite resource that is being wasted, rather than generated. I would argue that Imperial Beach Technology is generating political capital for the city by refusing to let the crisis be quietly buried.
I suppose that's one way to look at it.
Let's summarize where we find ourselves today. From my perspective, this campaign outlines a brilliant, structurally necessary strategy. Private research and relentless public records pressure, like the targeted FOIA appeals we discussed, are the most effective tools a disadvantaged local community has.
Right.
They pierce through the suffocating apathy of state and federal agencies, stripping away the plausible deniability regarding this immediate public health and economic crisis. By explaining exactly how these agencies hide, they force a conversation that the government desperately wants to avoid. And they create the legal and economic ammunition necessary to eventually force a physical fix.
And to summarize my position, while the documentation of the severe acute health and economic crisis is unquestionably valuable, we must not confuse transparency with accountability. Cataloging government failure, proving that agencies like the CEQ are legally insulated, and tracking the economic decay of a community does not automatically build the infrastructure needed to stop a cross-border sewage flow. Acknowledgement, no matter how loud or legally precise, is simply not engineering.
Yet, despite our disagreement on the ultimate efficacy of this documentation, we clearly converge on the central tragedy here. It is fundamentally unacceptable for an American beach town to endure long-term ocean closures, daily health fears from sewage odors inside their own homes, and catastrophic economic damage, all while federal and state agencies offer nothing but hollow future promises and bureaucratic deflections.
Absolutely. We are in complete agreement there. The structural realities detailed today, the intersection of a small municipal tax base, aging infrastructure, and a jurisdictional nightmare, paint a picture of a community left entirely to fend for itself.
Yeah.
The fact that it falls to a private research firm to even attempt to map the failure is a glaring indictment of the broader system. Our disagreement remains on whether an informational campaign can ever truly bridge the chasm between documenting a disaster and physically resolving it.
And that is a complexity you, our listeners, will have to weigh for yourselves. Which brings us back to our homeowner with the burst pipe. If the plumber refuses to come and the city shuts off its phone lines, do you sit quietly as the water rises, or do you start broadcasting the flood to the world, hoping someone, somewhere, is forced to bring a wrench?
It's a tough call.
It is. I think the broader insight here is that modern bureaucracies aren't built to solve cross-border anomalies. They're built to manage liability. And figuring out how to break through that defensive posture might be the most important civic skill of the next decade. We leave that for you to decide. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.